Are you looking? Are you looking just for a narrative, or because I don't want to break out a bunch of souvenirs.
Oh, I'd love that. But what I'm looking for is more about your personal story, your experiences through experiencing these major events through your perspective. Because we could talk about Iwo Jima, Guam, Okinawa, where we understand the history of the battles, but I'm curious to what you experienced while inside of a battleship. What was your daily duties like? Were you hot racking and stuff like that? So I'm looking for more your personal story.
Okay.
So with that being said then, Lloyd.
Because I'm only going to unwrap it once because this goes back 80 years.
Yeah. I was looking at that earlier.
And it's in delicate condition, so I don't open it very often. I graduated from boot camp in 1942, and there's my graduation picture.
Wow. And where did you graduate from, Lloyd?
Naval Training Station in San Diego.
I'm just going to do a pan shot real quick. I'm just going to do because I can't fit it all in one frame, I'm just going to slowly move it across. And if you want, I can scan this for you too. So if you ever want a digital copy of this, I can do that. So then that way you don't have to worry about unfurling it all the time. You can have a reprint of it, and you can show it all the time, and then you can keep the original in good condition. I'll put that back for you. But where are you actually in this photo?
One, two, three, in here. I think that's me right there.
Oh, look at that swell guy. Your Dixie cup is at a perfect 45-degree angle, it almost looks like. Wow. So you were class 237.
Right.
Okay. You guys have, they have leggings on.
And they were the recruit officers. They selected from the group certain people to act as petty officers for temporary petty officers.
Okay.
But they were actually members of the class.
Wow. Well, now I have some more questions for you. I'll put that away for you if you want. Yeah, if you want, I'd love for you to come by the museum, and I have scanners there, so I can scan this for you. And then all you'd have to do is just go to Kinko's, and they'll give you a whole life-size copy of it. And then this way you can keep safe. Oops. Okay. Well, with that being said, Lloyd, let me just get that. Tell me a little about your life. Where were you born and when?
I was born in Berkeley, California in December 28th of 1923.
And tell me a little about your family. Did you have any brothers or sisters?
I have all of my family is deceased now. My brother David was a year older, and my sister Nancy was 5 years younger. I don't know my parents' ages. My father died at 85. My mother was 99 when she passed. And that's basically was our family.
What were your parents' names?
My father's name was David Glick. My brother is David Jr. My mother's name was I have to think because I very seldom called her anything except mother. Lloyd, Lloita, Lloyd Glick.
And what did your parents do? What was your dad's
Well,
job?
my father was a pharmacist. He spent a good portion of his time traveling because he was what in those days was a traveling salesman for a pharmaceutical company, traveling to doctors' offices and giving out samples and promoting the sale of the product of his employer. That's still a profession today. Many times when I'm in the physician's office, I'll see a young lady come in lugging a briefcase, and I can tell she's a pharmacy representative.
Now, Lloyd, what was life growing up like in Berkeley?
Well, it was in the middle of the Depression, of course, 1923. It was not the height of the Depression, but it was toward the beginning of the Depression. Jobs were scarce, salaries were low. The economy was headed for the depth of depression, so we did not have a lot. We were mostly in rental property, sometimes property that belonged to relatives. In about 1929 or so, we reached the point where we could no longer maintain ourselves as a family. So I was sent to, or I guess you would have to say I was a charity patient, a charity case at a military academy in Rio Vista, California, academy called St. Joseph's Military Academy. And it was a Catholic institution. The nuns were in charge of the classes and teaching. I was there for 2 years. The second year, my brother joined me at the academy. During that time, my sister was virtually a baby. So my mother and my sister accompanied my father as he traveled on his sales routes, which covered the entire West Coast and inland, I think, as far as Denver. He would travel by train, and in the cities where he stopped, he would, of course, stay in a hotel. And I remember that my sister, being a baby, she slept in the one of the drawers of a dresser in the single room occupied by my parents. So they lived virtually on the road for the years that we were in the military academy. As the Depression lessened with early 30s, I guess you could say the election of President Roosevelt, things started to get a little bit better. Salaries were increased. My father was never totally unemployed, but his salary was very low, of course. So in those days, he was finally able to, and I don't know how he did it or who helped him, but he was able to secure a ownership of a residence in Berkeley. So that allowed them to bring the family back together again, and we lived together as a family in a house in the Kensington area of Berkeley, which is up in the Berkeley Hills. And I remember attending a junior high school in Berkeley, my high school years were spent in a high school in Oakland, which is adjacent to Berkeley, and the high school named University High School is no longer there now. It's been converted into a educational institution other than a high school. And we would take the streetcar from Kensington down to Oakland every day. During those times, I sold the Collier's magazine, the Saturday Evening Post. I used to get up early in the morning and go up to the train station and sell the Saturday Evening Post for 5 cents a copy. And I also had a newspaper route. I delivered papers, and also I was in the school's safety patrol, which meant holding out a stop sign at a crosswalk while the kids would come and go. And I did just about anything to come up with some coins. In those days, if you saw a penny on the street, you'd stop and pick it up, because a penny would get you a whole Tootsie Roll, a small Tootsie Roll. And so you would not ignore a penny on the street. Now when I drive through some of these restaurants, I can see the kids, after they make a purchase, I can see them throwing their pennies down onto the floor. And I almost want to climb down there and pick them up, but I don't, of course. So in the last year of high school, no, I have to correct myself. I graduated from high school in June of 1941, a few months before Pearl Harbor, and at that time, my father was no longer on the sales route. He had ceased working for this employer and had taken a job working for what was then the thrifty drugstores. This was in about 1949 or 1950. I correct myself again.
1939 and 40?
Yeah, we're still back at my high school graduation. At that time, he took a job in the drugstore in Kensington. That was it. And then at the same time, the employer who he another pharmaceutical company who had been in close friendship with my father's company, that pharmaceutical company owner hired my father to work for him at a substantial increase in compensation. But the trick was that he had to move to Los Angeles, which was the headquarters of the company. So and at that point, my brother had graduated high school and was a student at Pomona College. So the my sister and my mother accompanied my father to his new employment in Los Angeles, but since I had a job, such as it was, in Berkeley, I did not go south with them. They put me into a boarding house, which was in Berkeley, close to the University of California, because I was taking a couple of classes at UC Berkeley, which it's very involved, but UC Berkeley is a state institution, and they were associated with the high school in Oakland that I was attending. So because it was a state high school, I was allowed to, for instance, to participate with the symphony orchestra at the University of California, Berkeley. And I did not want to leave that environment. So my mother, a UC Berkeley graduate, arranged for me to go into a boarding house, a rooming house close to the university, and I took my meals across the street at a sorority house, so that she had previously been associated with. So I stayed in Berkeley while the family went down to Los Angeles, and at age 17 I was again on my own, and that lasted for 6 months until Pearl Harbor occurred.
And can you recall what you were doing and when you heard about the attack?
Yes, I know very well. I was sitting in a movie theater in Berkeley watching a movie. It was about 2 o'clock in the afternoon or so, and they stopped the movie and announced that all servicemen were to return to their base. We did not know why, but so several of the service people got up and left. Then they resumed the movie, and after the movie was over, I remember on the way driving back to my rooming house, I heard on my car radio about Pearl Harbor. Of course, there was already the draft was going and whatnot. I had registered for the draft. I did not particularly want to get drafted into the Army, but based on my musical education and participation with the Cal Symphony, I was able to apply for and audition for the U.S. Navy School of Music in Washington, D.C. The recruiting station told me that I had a good chance to go to the school. So many people were rushing to get into the service that you couldn't just go down to the recruiting station, sign a piece of paper, and be accepted. There was a waiting list, and etc. And I won't bore you with all of the details, but in December, just after Pearl Harbor, I went across the bay to San Francisco and attempted to enlist in the Navy with the idea of attending the School of Music. Lots of paperwork was required because I was 17, I had to get my parents' permission. That meant a drive to Los Angeles and a lot of of paperwork forced me to wait 4 months until April of 1942, by which time I had completed all the requirements for enlistment. But because the Navy's School of Music was a 1-year course, as they explained it to me as I was signing up, that I could not even be considered for the 1-year schooling unless I enlisted in the regular Navy, not as a draftee, but enlisted as just a regular enlistment for 6 years. So by that time I had turned 18, and in December, end of December, and so I enlisted on April the 24th of 1942. I left and went to the training station in San Diego, and I was there for several months. And in June of 42, I took the train across the country to Washington, D.C., where I again had to audition for acceptance. And on acceptance, I started to attend the school, which ended its summer break right at the end of June, and I stayed there for 1 year until June of 1943. At which point I had completed the course, and from amongst the graduating students, they formed several 20-piece bands. Basically an 18-piece swing band with a couple of extra players for ceremonial purposes. And so the 20 of us left the School of Music after the graduation and came back, always by train, back across the country to Point Mugu, where we boarded a tramp steamer that took us after a devious route and about 3.5 or more weeks. It took us to Noumea in New Caledonia, which is down by Australia, or in the Solomon Islands, south of the Solomons. And there, our band boarded the USS North Carolina battleship. I remained on the battleship for a little over 2 years until the end of the war, and other than a brief couple of months back for repairs in Bremerton, other than that, I was in the Pacific continually, and
if you don't mind, Lloyd, I'd like to regress a little back to 1942, because you mentioned you enlisted in April, correct?
Yes.
Of 42? So you were still living in California when the Japanese shelled Elwood.
When they shelled
Elwood. Did you ever hear
Yes.
about the Japanese submarine attacking?
Yes, I heard about that, but
How did you hear about
that attack, I believe that occurred after Pearl Harbor, and it occurred after I had left to go to the School of Music. I was not on the West Coast at the time of that attack. There were also incidents of the Japanese sending balloons over Oregon and supposedly starting forest fires. There were all sorts of rumors, and of course the movement of the internment of the Japanese citizens at the various camps. All of that occurred after I went into the service, if I have my story correctly. But in any case, I was not aware of all of that. That was something apart from me. I knew very little about wartime conditions on the civilian side, because I was never here except for one time when I had a 30-day leave at the conclusion of my 1 year at the school, and before
Before Point Magoo.
which was interesting because when the class graduated, I took a train. We were automatically eligible for a 30-day leave, so I took a train, 2.5 or 3 days across the country back to where my folks had now located in Los Angeles, and I spent several weeks there with them, and then I got back on the train and returned to Washington, D.C. That's another couple of days back across the country. Went to the School of Music, met up with my 20-piece band, and the same day we went right back to the train station, got on the train, and went to Point Magoo. So I made a couple of quick trips across the country. During that leave, that was the same time that they were having the so-called Zoot Suit problem in Los Angeles. And so servicemen were restricted from going into downtown Los Angeles. And my family was living actually in Alhambra, which is adjacent to Los Angeles, and basically a bedroom community. So I spent most of the time in Alhambra rather than going into actual Los Angeles. But as to the civilian activity, what was going on in the States, I was not really. That wasn't a part of my life. My life by that point was the Navy, and while I was not unaware of the civilian aspect, because my folks everything was rationed, from clothing to even to butter and sugar and meat and all these other rationing, gasoline. My father had obtained an A sticker, which I think allowed him to get a couple of gallons of gas a week, and rationing was in full force at that time.
And when you left your parents, that's where you went to Point Magoo?
No, when I left my parents following my leave, yes, it was back to Washington, picked up my band, and came back to Point Magoo. And I even remember the name of the tramp steamer. It was called the Mormon Port, because it was one of the old Mormon shipping lines, freighters that they had converted to troop ship. And it was the most miserable 3 weeks at sea I've ever spent.
How so?
Well, because there were I don't know, hundreds of service people on this ship, all headed to the South Pacific. From various branches, not only just the Navy, but there were some Army troops, etc. But in any case, the ship was extremely crowded. I remember that you had to stand up to eat because there were no mess halls. The bunks were constructed of wood, and it was miserable down below decks. The restrooms, we call them.
Okay. And We're back. So life on this troop ship, as you're proceeding to New Caledonia, what was the smells like? Was everyone getting seasick? Did you hit any typhoons?
Well, yes, there were quite a few of the people getting seasick because the ship was traveling it was not traveling at a great speed. My best recollection is probably maybe 10, 12 knots, and you can do a lot of rolling at that speed, and in addition, quite a few of the kids had never been on a ship before, and it was quite an experience. But I remember particularly only because they had built temporary restrooms up on the main deck, and they were essentially just a trough that went over the side of the ship, and it was in my, as I remember it, it was very rudimentary. It was difficult, for instance, the showers were impossible because of the hundreds of troops on the ship. So I remember wishing that there had been better facilities. However, we were somewhat fortunate in that the ship had no entertainment of any kind, and having a band aboard, well, we were quite popular because we would play music for them on the way over. So that meant that we would not have to stand in line for chow and things like that. But in any case,
did you ever have to perform reveille since you're a trumpeter or anything like that?
No, because the Navy had its own buglers. That was a rating. It was bugler, and every ship, every major ship had its own buglers. Like on the North Carolina, we had 2 buglers, and all bugling that was necessary, which was mostly ceremonial, and bugling calls like mess call and that kind of thing, all done by the buglers. But they lived in the same compartment of the ship with us, and we were quite friendly with the buglers.
Did they ever play with your band?
No, okay. No. They had the distinct separation between buglers and trumpeters. However, we in the band on the ship, on some occasions, would play in various compartments on the ship for special occasions, like Christmas time. We would put together a small brass quintet, and we would go around the ship and playing Christmas carols and whatnot.
In the different compartments?
Yes. Particularly the living quarters, the berthing areas. The officers, of course, that was another thing entirely. They were completely separate from the enlisted people. They had their own wardroom, their own meals, their own food supply. But we would occasionally take a small group of maybe 8 or 9 players and go up to the wardroom and play dinner music while they had their meals. But back to the buglers, I can still remember that one of the buglers, his name was Billheimer, and Billheimer was a close friend of mine. I think his bunk was close by mine, and we spent quite a bit of time, not in the bunks, but in the berthing area, the living quarters.
On the North Carolina?
On the North Carolina. So, on occasions, I can think of maybe 2 or 3 times, I would play taps at night. I'd go with him up to the area of the navigation area where he would be playing taps, and I would substitute and play the actual number, but no, I was never a formal bugler on the North Carolina.
Now,
I was a bugler in Boy Scouts before when I was 12, and going back way back. When I was in the Boy Scouts at 12, I would earn my summer trip to Boy Scout camp by acting as a camp bugler. And so my parents wouldn't, of course they couldn't afford to send me, but by being the camp bugler I got a free ride through. Summer camp lasted, I think it was 3 sessions of 2 weeks each. So I was there for about 6 weeks. And doing nothing but being the camp bugler.
Now, Lloyd, now going back forward from Boy Scouts, can you recall when you arrived in New Caledonia? Did you already know you were going to be assigned to the North Carolina?
I knew it. Oh, I knew that when we left Washington, D.C. Yes, we left. Our band was under the control and direction of a chief petty officer, whose rating was bandmaster, and he would be like the musical director of a group, and he had the orders for the group, and on the train when we left Washington, he opened the orders and told us we were headed for the USS North Carolina.
So the orders were sealed even up to that point?
At that point, yes. But we did not know where our band was going until we got underway for it.
And that's when you came back from Los Angeles to DC to join
Right.
the band, that's when you found it?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah.
Now, quick question, as you were going onto this troop trip over to New Caledonia, were you guys part of a convoy or were you a solitary ship?
We were a solitary ship.
And then, did you ever have to perform a zigzag pattern? Were there any threats from submarines?
The ships all traveled on zigzag, particularly in the hours before sunrise and sunset.
And is that because they're silhouetted a lot more on the horizon?
It's because on a rising or a sun or a setting sun, the sun is low enough to the water line that it creates a silhouette for a submarine periscope.
So size and distance for speed and all that's a lot easier to calculate. That makes
Right.
sense.
On every ship, well, I was only on North Carolina, but every ship in the task force did the same thing. They would wake you up at about 4:30, 5 o'clock in the morning, and you go to general quarters for an hour to an hour and a half to encompass sunrise, and then again in the evening they had general quarters at sunset for an hour to an hour and a half.
And since you were in the band, what was your duty station during general quarters?
Our battle station was in damage control, firefighting. They had, among other things, they put the band and some of the other damage control people. We all went to fire school at Pearl Harbor, and but I was a much better trumpet player than I was a fireman.
Were there any instances when training for fire that there were mishaps or anything like that?
Well, training is when they put you in the firefighting school, part of the school was to put you inside a concrete room, shut the door, start the fires, and you were in there with the fire, and you could come out. So it was, the fire was actually, if I remember correctly, it was a fuel oil substance of some kind that was burning, controlled burn. But the room was full of flame and heat, and it was not a pleasant experience at all. But we had a inch and a half fire hose, and but which is kind of odd because during the entire couple of years I was on the ship, we never had a fire except in the incinerator, and that was a controlled fire. And we were, fortunately enough, we were never damaged by a torpedo or anything that would require action by the damage control party that I was assigned to.
And for fire damage control teams, were they assigned to a specific compartment, or were they kind of more reactionary to where any incident would be?
It depended. There was what they call damage control central, which was three decks down, and it was like fire headquarters, and had communication throughout the ship, and there were throughout the ship that were what they call repair parties, which would be maybe 5 or 6 sailors in a group. They would be specialized. They would wear fire equipment and whatnot, but throughout the ship, in each of, not each, but in many of the compartments, the living quarters, and particularly up in the officers' country, on all through the ship, there would be a single sailor in a compartment, and he or I would have a sound-powered telephone hooked into a circuit on which we could all communicate, but all of these circuits went down to damage central control. So when we went to general quarters, I would go to this particular, wherever my station was, and it changed probably half a dozen times while I was in the 2.5 years I was there. At one time it was up in officer country, and the next time it was in the chief petty officers mess. I would go there and seal off the doors on both ends of the compartment, and the watertight doors, and various each compartment had different items within that area that I was stationed. Some would be ventilator controls, which would be wheels up on the overhead to close ventilators. Then there would be valves to isolate certain fuel lines. Part of the damage control, or part of your qualification for rating promotion, involved not only music, but it involved passing a test on damage control, like identifying fuel lines versus versus water lines versus ventilation lines. You had to know in this particular area, you had to know where each of these pipes and such were, what was inside and where they went.
And how did they test you? Was it they just
you took a test?
So it's not like an assessment where you were in the compartment and you were pointing all this out. This was an actual just physical test.
Right. It was a physical sit-down written test, and we'd have pictures of a section of pipe, and of course every pipe inside of a ship had a marking on it in color, like it would have three black bands circling the pipe.
And that'd be fuel?
And you had to know that those three meant that it was potable water, or there would be a red one, and you knew, of course, that was a fuel line.
Because red for flammable?
Yeah. So, and you had to know what was in that line, and where the nearest, in your compartment, where the nearest shut-off valve was. So when you first go aboard the ship, they give you a tour of the ship. They took the whole band, of course, as a natural group, and they took us down to the 5 decks down into the engine rooms, and the main induction valve and the forward chain locker, all of these lower compartments, and then they would take you into, for instance, the ammunition storage area, which is inside of what they call the barbette, and the barbette is a solid steel circular compartment that runs from the bottom of the ship in the magazines all the way up to the turret, 7 decks up, and you would work your way through the machinery and from deck to deck to deck, going up inside the barbette until you eventually reached a manhole that allowed you to go up actually into the bottom of the turret, because the turret sits on the top of the barbette, and inside the turret are the gun houses and whatnot. So you got a thorough tour of the ship, bottom to top, and then once you were assigned your battle station, you got a second tour by the chief petty officer, who would explain everything to you and how you do what you're supposed to do. And then I kept a notebook in which I would detail the various vent pipes and things that I needed to know, what to turn, to do what in that area in which I was assigned.
And do you still have that notebook?
No.
Now that was what you're describing is what your experience was first arriving on the North Carolina.
Right.
And how long, when you arrived to the Carolina, were you guys in port before you moved on?
Oh, I have no way of knowing. My memory's not that good because we were in and out of port so many times. New Mia was at that time the base where what Navy we had, which was 3 aircraft carriers and 3 battleships and a bunch of cruisers. That was all we had by way of Navy in the South Pacific. All of the battleships, all 8 battleships, had been sunk at Pearl Harbor. And so that North Carolina was the first new battleship, called a fast battleship, to come from the United States down to the Pacific. So when the North Carolina, Pearl Harbor was in December, 4 months later, the North Carolina left the East Coast, went through the Panama Canal, and went down to the South Pacific. And at that point, this was before any of the major battles like Coral Sea or etc. And the North Carolina arrived down there, and when she first got there, she was the only battleship. There were a bunch of cruisers. There were 3 aircraft carriers, the Enterprise, the Saratoga, and the
Wasp or Yorktown.
Oh, come on! It's up in Oakland now.
Hornet? No.
It's a name that escapes me every time I try to remember it. It's either a bird.
It's not the kitty.
Like a bee or
the wasp, or the hornet.
No, the hornet. The hornet. The hornet and the
Saratoga and Enterprise.
Enterprise, Saratoga. No, Enterprise and the Hornet and the Lexington. The Saratoga had gone back to San Diego for some repairs. And there some Navy we had in the South Pacific, and it was basically, it was called the seventh. It was called Task Force 61, and it had 2 task units: the 17 and 18. And I believe the 18 was the Enterprise. The 17 was the Lexington, and 16 was the Hornet. So those, and they were all under the command of Admiral Fletcher, and the North Carolina. Some 2 or 3 months after, later, a second battleship came down, and that was the USS Washington, which is the sister ship of the North Carolina. And those 2 ships, the North Carolina and the Washington, had been under construction for a year or so before Pearl Harbor. It was when the Washington Treaty fell apart, and the Japanese built 2 major big battleships called the Yamato
and Musashi.
And the Mitsubishi.
Yep.
And because they built those 2 big battleships, it was necessary, obviously, for us to have equivalent power. So the United States put under construction the North Carolina and the Washington, so-called fast battleships. So the Washington came down, and for a while it was those 2, and then later they built a second group of 4 battleships as a group to follow the North Carolina and the Washington, and that was the Alabama, Massachusetts, Indiana, and South Dakota. And those 4 battleships came down to the Pacific. The first being the South Dakota, which ran into some trouble, and then came the Indiana, and then ultimately the Alabama stayed on the East Coast and never did come down to the South Pacific. So for a long time, clear up until almost the end of 1944 and the beginning of 45, when they built a third group of 4 ships, which are the big 4 of
Missouri.
the Iowa,
Missouri.
and the Wisconsin, and Iowa, New Jersey, Wisconsin, and Missouri, Wisconsin, Iowa, and New Jersey. Those 4, the big 4. So we had 4 in that class, 4 in the South Dakota class, 2 in the North Carolina class, and those 10 battleships were the 10 battleships that fought together with the aircraft carriers in the 3rd Fleet and the 5th Fleet under Halsey and Spruance. The older battleships, the 8 of the 8 battleships that were sunk at Pearl Harbor, 2 of them were totally sunk, the Oklahoma and the Arizona. And the other 6 were raised back up and reconditioned, repaired is what I'm trying to say. And those 6 battleships were not fast enough to travel with the fast battleships and the carriers, so they were assigned separately as what's called the 7th Fleet, and those 6 battleships were under the control of the of General MacArthur's 7th area. They backed up the Marines who were fighting on Guadalcanal and whatnot, and all through the war, the 7th Fleet was separate from the 3rd Fleet. The 3rd Fleet was formed in Ri when we, after the Battle of Midway, when we started to go on the offensive. Admiral Halsey, who had fought in Guadalcanal under MacArthur, was transferred under Nimitz in Pearl Harbor, and he became the admiral for the 3rd Fleet, which was formed in, I think, February of 1943. And those are the 10 battleships that fought the offensive of under Nimitz of island hopping across the Central Pacific.
The Marianas, the Marshalls.
Starting with the invasion of Tarawa, and going from Tarawa to Kwajalein to the Marianas, to the Philippines, etc. They were going across the Central Pacific.
Now, were you on the North Carolina when Tarawa was invaded?
Yes.
Really?
That was the first major action that we saw after we boarded, because when we went aboard in September of 43, they were just wrapping up Guadalcanal, and we caught the last of the. We supported the occupation and taking of Henderson Field, and that was the end of the Guadalcanal campaign. And then there was a bunch of smaller actions by the Marines. They landed, I think they went into New Georgia, New Britain,
New Gloucester.
Yeah, and had battles.
largest naval battles in pretty much all of World War II happened down in the Solomons at Iron Bottom Sound.
In the Solomons, there was that was the Battle of Santa Cruz, and then the Battle of Eastern Solomons, and the Battle of Savo Island. Savo was where our sister ship, the Washington, and the South Dakota caught an incoming or southbound. The Japanese
Tokyo Express
were trying to the Tokyo Express. They were trying to land their troops on Guadalcanal to retake Henderson Field. They made constant efforts to take Guadalcanal and retake Henderson Field.
And they kept trying to resupply.
They couldn't do it. So at the Battle of Savo, they finally sent a major force of two battleships and a bunch of cruisers, and they came south. And at nighttime, there was a battle between where our force caught the southbound Japanese because we had broken the code and we knew that they were coming. Our ships had radar, their ships did not. They were great night fighters, the Japanese.
That's what I heard.
But they still used their eyeball gunnery. We used radar. The South Dakota, the Japanese observed and took under fire the South Dakota, and they shot the hell out of the South Dakota, forced it to leave the scene. But what they did not realize was that the North Carolina was on the other side of coming around Savo with radar watching the whole thing.
And you were on that vessel at the time?
No.
Oh, okay,
We hadn't gotten there
You hadn't gotten there yet, okay.
And so the Washington took the force under fire, and they shot up the Japanese battleship Kirishima. And they forced it. It didn't sink that night. They forced it to retreat, and it sunk in the middle of the night. So the Washington fired on and sunk the Kirishima. That was the first of two instances in the entire Pacific War where there was a surface action between battleships. The second was, of course, at Leyte Gulf. But so only 2 times during the entire war was there a ship-to-ship gunfire, battleships sinking. So our warfare was not, if you can picture it, ships firing upon other ships and watching the sailors die and all of this.
It's not like the Battle of Jutland where they're firing.
Had nothing to do like World War I
Yeah.
and some of the others. The basic role of the battleships, the first and primary duty was air defense for the aircraft carriers, because aircraft carriers were somewhat limited in armament. They had a limited number of 5-inch guns and some 40 millimeters, but nothing with which to substantially defend themselves. They were at the mercy of the Japanese. But so our battleships would always sail within a few miles of the aircraft carrier and serve as a protection. During the major portion of the initial action in the South Pacific, where there was only the Enterprise and 2 other carriers. The North Carolina's primary function was as a guard plane, a guard ship for the Enterprise. So the Enterprise in North Carolina had a very close association. How can I put the sequence here? After Guadalcanal, came Midway, and it was at Midway. I correct myself. I'm out of sequence entirely.
That's fine.
Midway was within the first 4 months after Pearl Harbor.
June in 42.
Right, in 42. Midway, there were no battleships present because the North Carolina had not come down there yet, and all the other battleships were sunk at Pearl. So Midway was aircraft, were the 3 aircraft carriers. Actually, it was only 2 until the Yorktown, which had been damaged
At Coral Sea. The Battle of the Coral Sea?
Yeah, at Coral Sea. The Yorktown had gone back to Pearl, and she was quickly jury-rigged, and she came back out and joined Enterprise and
Hornet?
the name I just forgot.
The Hornet?
Hornet had done the no, Hornet had not yet done the bomber run. Yorktown, boy, I'm out of sequence in my thinking.
Oh, it's fine.
We've got we've had Coral Sea, and then we've had Midway, and then the North Carolina came out in June of. She came out in June of 42. She was torpedoed. The North Carolina came out in June of 42, was torpedoed in September of 42, and because she was torpedoed in September of 42, thus missing Coral Sea. And South Dakota was not there. I'd have to do some research to get my thinking back.
Oh, it's fine. Because I'm still really curious. Since the North Carolina participated with the invasion of Tarawa,
Yes.
can you recall how the fleet arrived at Tarawa? Were you pretty much below decks the entire time, or?
During the entire Tarawa action, well, it started out with about a 2-day bombardment.
And what's a bombardment, if you don't mind me
A
asking?
bombardment is where the battleships who are traveling with the carriers, they split off, and as a unit, the battleships will go about 12 miles offshore of the island, and they'll sit there with those 16-inch guns and just repetitively fire the projectiles. These big 16-inch projectiles that weigh around 2,700 pounds each, and they'll fire them onto the island and just literally level, take every palm tree and knock it down, and leave nothing but just bare sand. And that all of that is done for, it takes, sometimes you go on board for a day, sometimes only a few hours, maybe a day, maybe 2 days. At a place like Okinawa, you might pre-bombard for 3 days, periodically, and you prepare the beach for the landing.
Now you mentioned this preliminary bombardment lasting for a few days.
Sometimes depends on which island you're talking about. Like Guam was, there were intermittent bombing over a period of days at Guam. But we would sail in, bombard for 4 or 6 hours, sail away, then maybe a few days later come back and bombard again. Or if we're en route from one place to another, we might swing by a place like Truck and bombard with no intention of landing, just bombard,
target practice,
just for the hell of it, and go on to to the target area. We never did occupy or Truck. Truck was always a major Japanese
stronghold,
anchorage, but we never actually occupied Truck. We bypassed it the way it is.
Now back to Tarawa. Was that your first time?
Tarawa was our no. We bombarded some islands in the Solomons.
Were you on the vessel at that time when that happened? Those other bombardments?
Yes. After we went aboard in Noumea, the ship operated out of Noumea for a short period of time, and I don't remember how much. I can look at the log. And then we would bombard Japanese places like Rabaul and some of the others, but not occupy, just bombard.
But you got close enough to Rabaul that you could bombard it with.
Yeah.
Wow.
Is that book?
Oh, yeah, I have it.
That little book that I read.
Yes, it's right, I think, under here.
Here we are. Okay.
There we are. Yeah.
Those are the 15 battles that the North Carolina was involved in. It almost, wait a minute here, I'll give you some help. Come out of here.
Oh, perfect. Cheers.
And you see the first 3 of them are crossed off.
Mm-hmm.
The first 3 that are crossed off were actions by the ship before our band went aboard.
Okay, that makes sense.
And then from there and all the way down to the end of the war, we were on the ship.
Because I actually have some questions in regards to this timeline, but would you be able to move back in that spot? Perfect. Thank you. So, looking at this timeline, so you already had some experience with shore bombardment by the time you got to Tarawa on the North Carolina.
Yeah, yes.
Can you recall what you experienced when you first felt those guns go off?
Right. My battle station always was below main deck. I never had a above deck battle station. So the very first time they fired the 16s, and I'm not sure I can remember the very first time to label it as the very first time, because we did practice target shooting at floating targets and all sorts of things. But I do remember that I was in my compartment, my assigned compartment, which was in officer country and was right adjacent to the barbette of number 2 turret, on the deck below the main deck. And it was, of the totality of the ship, the barbette coming up, etc. My area of responsibility was this half of that area. Another band member had this half. So, and we could walk around the whole thing. So while I was alone over here, several a different band member, Goodyear, had this side, and being in that area, in when the 16s were fired, they don't have a sharp bang per se. They make a kind of a rumbling sound when you're below decks, and you can feel a slight vibration of the air and a little compression, but it's basically, I would say it's like being in a farmhouse in the middle of the country when there's a thunderstorm overhead, and thunder is going off right over your farm. That's what it would sound like down below decks. And the farther down you are, the less the sound. If you're in the engine room, you don't even know they're firing them. But
so that,
to the contrary, the 5-inch guns, which are in mounts on the side, 5 mounts on each side of the ship, and each of those mounts are 2 5-inch guns. When those are fired, you get a sharp percussion sound, which is much more disturbing than the 16-inch.
How so?
I know, I can remember when my battle station was in the chief petty officer's mess, I was right adjacent. I was one deck below the actual mount, and right in the same area was a handling room. And every 5-inch mount has a handling room where the ammunition, the fuses are set, and the ammunition is all made ready to go up, because inside that turret there's not room to store ammunition. So the ammunition is in the handling room, and it comes up on the track, and at the top of the track it bends and goes right adjacent to the gun itself. So the one of the gunners picks up a 25 or 30 pound powder projectile made brass powder thing, and he as it comes out of this tunnel, they set the fuse. No, I'm sorry, the fuse is set in the handling room. It comes out, he picks it up, he turns it, he gives it to another guy, and it goes into a tray, and it gets rammed up into the barrel of the 5-inch gun. And after the firing, the breech opens up, comes back. The powder can exits off the gun, falls to the deck of the handling room of the turret, and from there it's physically passed out through a manhole at the back of the turret and out onto the deck. So the those 5-inch guns basically for our use were used as anti-aircraft weapons. They were not fired toward land. They were an air defensive weapon. On the older battleships and on destroyers that would go and give fire support for the Marines on the island who are doing the fighting, some of those destroyers would come in right off the beach, just outside the shore wave act, the surf, and they would just go make runs right back up and down, and they would use those 5-inch guns for what they called call fire by the Marines on the beach. They would call for fire support, and those 5-inch guns would fire over their heads right into the Japanese. But we never did that with battleships. The battleships were always 10, 12, 14 miles away from the island. But
when hearing those 5 inches go off, that can only mean one thing: air attack.
well, right, well, yes. When we were under air attack, the first thing that you would hear would be the 5-inch, and then you'd sit there and you'd listen to them banging away, and then all of a sudden you'd hear the brrr of the 20 millimeters, and the 20 millimeters were a single operated 20 millimeter weapon on a stand on the deck, and they would fire only when the target plane was approaching, because their range, their accuracy was almost nil when they were fired at a long distance. But sometimes in practice training, they would have one of the planes from the carriers would come by towing a target at the end of a cable off the end of the plane, and it'd be like a wind tunnel thing, and they'd tow it along, and the 20 millimeters would try to hit it.
Did you yourself ever do any gunnery practice?
No, I never touched a gun. I never touched a weapon of any kind unless I could hit it with my trumpet. But for hour upon hour, sometimes the 20 millimeters would be doing training. But if you're sitting in your compartment, you don't know what's going on up there until you hear the 5-inch go, and when the fives go, then you know that the target that it has come within a fairly close range. Later in the war, one of the best kept secrets was the proximity fuse. Once they started using the proximity fuse, those 5-inch guns were phenomenally successful, because they didn't have to hit the plane. all they had to do was get within the reasonable area and of the enemy plane. The proximity fuse would fire off shrapnel, and the Japanese plane would fly into this shrapnel, which would hit the engines or the propellers or God knows what, and down went the plane.
See, what's interesting about the proximity fuse is Newport Beach actually has a historical connection. A woman by the name of Elizabeth Starr, her father, Richard Dempsey, lived in Newport Beach, went to London during the Blitz, came back, and that's where he helped invent the proximity fuse. So that's how I originally learned more about it and the effectiveness of the proximity fuse. I mean, this fuse was so important that when the Germans launched the Battle of the Bulge in the Ardennes, they started issuing proximity fuses to the artillery crews to be able to basically do airbursts against the Germans. But it just shows you how important technologically those were, because what was the proximity fuse most effective against that you guys experienced? Kamikazes.
Yeah, exactly. What's the kamikazes, I kind of got out of the sequence. We left I think in our talks, we left at Tarawa.
Yeah.
And then following Tarawa, we did a bunch of small island bombardments and whatnot, but the next major was Kwajalein. Kwajalein, we bombarded the island for a bit. The Marines landed and took it with no problem. There were some Japanese on there, but no problem. And Kwajalein became our fleet anchorage. And Kwajalein was our first fleet anchorage after we left the South Pacific. And after Kwajalein, then we undertook the campaigns against the Marshals. Kwajalein was in the Marshals. It was the Marianas that we started with, Saipan and Tinian and Guam. And let's see, after the
prior to talking about the Marianas, there was one action in the Marshall Campaign that I was curious if you could recollect, and that was the Battle of Roy.
Roy was a small island. There were two small islands, Roy and Namur. And those were we took those under fire coincidentally and along with Tarawa. And there was another one called Nauru. And our ship was primarily responsible for Nauru. That was our target island, as opposed to Tarawa itself. But because the fleet at that point broke up into task units and each unit had separate targets, ours was Nauru.
Now at Maruru, did you ever witness an enemy aircraft that was shot down at that time?
No, because I was below decks. The only, I would leave my battle station, and which was permissible. I'd tell them on sound power telephone, I'm going topside, and my other compartment around the corner would cover both areas. And I would go up topside, mainly to the signal bridge. And that's a bit of another story, but I was on the ship for so long that I'll back you up even further. Most sailors that came aboard the ship were on the ship for a year. At the end of some of them just a matter of months, but the average was around a year. and then that sailor would be transferred. He'd go back to the States, either to a reassignment to another ship, or maybe to a shore station, or a training base or something, and be replaced. So there was a constant rotation of troops, of people coming aboard. But all of the bands that were serving on these ships, all of these bands were bands that had come from the Navy School of Music. The school in Washington, the commander of that school was in close contact with the Bureau of Personnel, Bupers, which made quite a few of the assignments. So the head of the school, a guy by the name of Thurman, was able to make the assignments of these bands to the various ships. He's the one that assigned the band to the North Carolina, for instance. He would rotate these bands off the ship after a while and bring them back to the school, refresher course for a couple of months, and then send them to a new station. For some reason, known only to Thurman and to God, he overlooked the band on the North Carolina. So instead of doing a year and rotating, after we went out there, we stayed there till the end of the war, as bands from other ships were going back to the school. We stayed out there for the entire war. So, by being on the ship for over 2 years, I formed association with some of the crew, obviously, for no other reason than just pure young kids' interest. I took an interest in the signal bridge because I liked being up and I could see everything. And some of the signalmen were very good friends with the band because we entertained so much on the ship, and we attracted followers. So a handful of these guys up there were my close friends. And when I had free time, I'd just go up to the signal bridge and socialize with them. But I got to the point that I could read the incoming light signals better than they could.
Now there sounds like there's a story there.
What?
This sounds like there's a story there. Because you mentioned you had a funny little story about the signal bridge in itself.
Well, I would learn the way the signal bridge operates. When there's an incoming message, a signalman who's on duty goes to the light and he acknowledges it with an R. And so the other ship starts sending the message. After each word is sent, the signalman on the receiving ship holds his light open. That means, I understand, I caught that word. So signalmen are judged by how often they don't acknowledge a word, and it has to be repeated. As the signalman gives the R, meaning I'm on the air, ready to receive, he calls for, and there's another signalman who comes and has a writing pad, because you can't receive and write at the same time. So he's calling out the word as it comes in. But most of them are in code, and the code is in groups of 5 letters. So the receiving guy will be, say, William Roger X-ray 21-2 or something like that. The guy's writing it down. doing the writing is not a very glamorous job. And sometimes when I would be up there, I would do the writing for a friend of mine. Because after I had been up there for 6 months or so, I knew all the signal crew. And even the flags, occasionally, I would do the downhaul on the flag hoists, just because I was there. And or if my friend missed one of those 5 groups, I would tell him what it was. In any case, spending all that time on the signal bridge and having learned the codes, when they would go from condition zebra to condition Y, I would go to the signal bridge, which I could do by going up the inside through the towers, etc., and not across the open decks. So from the signal bridge, I could borrow one of their binoculars. They had these big binoculars that were mounted on a stand and had 2 arms like this, and I would look through there, and I could watch, for instance, at Iwo Jima, I would stand up there and I would watch the tanks on the beach from 12 miles out as the flamethrowers were throwing flames and all of this. And I could watch it for maybe 15, 20 minutes, and then I would go down below again. But I was never up there during an actual, say, kamikaze attack or something. But sometimes after a kamikaze attack, and it was over, they would break to Y, I would go back, I would go up there, and I would look out over the fleet, and I could see where aircraft carriers had been hit by kamikazes, like the Ticonderoga carrier, which was the closest carrier to where we were in the fleet. I could see the damage to the Ticonderoga, and more particularly, toward the end of the war, the carrier Franklin. We were in the same task unit with the Franklin, and after the attack, we sailed past the Franklin while she was burning, and because the task force kept going, of course, and I got a good look at the Franklin.
Can you describe what you witnessed?
What I saw?
Yeah.
I got a picture of it here someplace among my stuff. It's one of the pictures that wait a minute. Did I bring that book? You're welcome to look through some of these books.
Because the USS Franklin, she took a kamikaze right in the center deck, if I recall.
No.
Oh, okay.
She took 2 bombs from a level bomber.
Oh, that came out of it was a single one, though, right?
Yeah, single plane.
Single plane, I remember that.
2 bombs that hit on the stern, on the rear portion of the flight deck, and
and when you were passing the Franklin,
Was she still performing damage control, or had they had
Well,
already?
she was burning like hell, and all of the sailors were on one side of the flight deck because she was listing to starboard. So the crew, those that were up on the flight deck, were all on the port side. That's not the picture I'm looking for.
I know which photo you're referring to, though.
It's in this book.
See. There she is. Yeah.
There she is.
And this is taken from this angle. This is taken from the Carolina.
No, this is taken from the cruiser Santa Fe.
Okay.
The cruiser Santa Fe had come alongside, and the crew from the hangar deck, which was burning from stern to bow, the crew were coming out onto this radio antenna, which normally sits up in the air like this, but because of aircraft taking off and landing, during air operations, this antenna it drops down and becomes parallel to the ocean surface. So the crew was coming out the antenna and dropping down onto the deck of the Santa Fe. And the captain of Gary's of the
Franklin.
the Franklin ordered the Santa Fe to stand away. Well, there's a whole nother story about Gary's, the most hated captain in the Navy almost. He
Books for you.
Are you? He lost, I think, close to about 1,100 of his crew, they had to jump off the ship. There was no way because the ship was burning from stern to bow, and was totally on fire. Lots of people in compartments that had no other exit were forced to jump through portholes and other exits into the ocean. It was either stay aboard and die or make the jump.
And
They didn't voluntarily just jump for the hell of it. But quite a few of the crew were forced to jump, and many of them were recovered out of the water by other ships, destroyers and the cruisers. Were picking up survivors by the hundreds out of the ocean. And there were about 700 and some odd sailors that actually fought the fires on the ship. The ones that jumped and were rescued were ultimately taken back to fleet anchorage at Ulithi. After the fires were put out on the Franklin, the Birmingham, and I think it was the Birmingham cruiser, took Franklin under tow and towed her back to Ulithi. At Ulithi, they made temporary repairs and were able to get the ship to making 1 or 2 or 3 knots, and with the assistance of a tow, they got the ship back to Pearl. But at Ulithi, while they were making emergency repairs, they attempted to return the 1,100 or whatever number of sailors had jumped into the ocean. were going to return to the Franklin, Captain Gary's refused to take him back aboard. First, he wanted to court-martial them all for jumping, for leaving the ship. He was dissuaded from any court-martialing, but he refused to take those sailors back aboard as the Franklin left to go back to Pearl. Gary said, "I will only take the 700 who actually stayed and fought the fire. And I'm forming what I'm going to call the 700 Club." Well, you can imagine not only how the sailors felt who were not allowed back on the ship, but word about that got out through the whole fleet. And everybody knew what Gary had done. And he was hated. I mean, I think if they could have gotten to him, they would have killed him.
You witnessed the Franklin burning yourself.
Oh yes.
How did you feel hearing about that?
I felt sorry for the sailors that were that were jumping or had jumped. I was sorry for the ones that I could see up on the flight deck. But I don't remember any other strong feeling, because ships hit by kamikazes were not strange at that point in the war. We were getting carriers hit almost every day, but and I had no personal friends on the Franklin, so I don't remember any visceral reaction of any kind. Just taking a look at it, and I did not spend a lot of time looking at it either, because we sailed past and kept going. But one of the odd features, coincidental of the whole thing, after the war was over and our band left the North Carolina in Tokyo, outside of Tokyo Bay, we went eventually back to the School of Music, and I took a 6-month refresher course. And of course the war was over, and I had still 2 years to go on my 6-year enlistment. So when I finished the refresher course, I was reassigned to the band, to a band which was stationed in San Diego, and needed a trumpet player as a replacement for somebody being discharged. So I was sent singularly to San Diego as a replacement to this band, which was at that point assigned on the Naval Air Station in North Island in San Diego. When I got there, I found out that the captain of the air station was Gary's, who had left the Franklin, had been gone back to New York, and eventually he had been reassigned as the commanding officer of the Naval Air Station San Diego.
But talk about a coincidental walk down the road. You're
Right.
at the same duty station.
Right, and we would play for inspections on Saturday mornings at the Naval Air Station, and the band would be out there with all the various troops lined up, the sailors, and the captain would come by, and he'd go by the band and salute the bandmaster, and I'd look over there, and here's this Captain Gary's coming by. Very, very odd coincidence.
Well, Lloyd, we've actually already been here for almost 2 hours.
You're
FYI.
kidding.
Nope, we've already been here talking for 2 hours. So I don't want to keep you too much longer, just because I have no problem asking more questions for the next hour, but I do have some questions I would like just in case.
Of course.
So,
but I point out that on my Saturday visits to the Iowa, I'm there for almost 6 hours, and
Time flies.
one after another talking about this stuff. Yeah.
Well, one thing I wanted to ask you about, if you experienced and if you can recall that experience, was Typhoon Cobra.
Cobra, yes. Yes.
And can you describe what was that and what happened?
Well, Cobra, I could take the full hour just on Cobra, but Cobra was a typhoon that occurred off of the in the Philippine Sea, and it was I think it was a week or so before Christmas in 1944, and we were sailing with the Third Fleet under Halsey, who it was intermittently. It was either the Third Fleet or the Fifth Fleet, depending upon whether Halsey or Admiral Spruance they rotated control. But Halsey on the New Jersey battleship, New Jersey, was the admiral in charge of the fleet, which consisted of 4 task units. And there were, I don't know, maybe 30 or so ships in each of those task units. Suffice that of an afternoon, the seas were beginning to pick up, getting a little bit rough. We were going to refuel the destroyers, some of the destroyers, because they were low on fuel. It had been a number of days before we were able to refuel. And we had destroyers alongside our ship, as did most of the other ships in the task unit. And the seas were getting really rough, to the point that fuel lines running from our ship over to the destroyer, the 2 ships being side by side, could not maintain station, and the destroyers were going like this because of the wave action. And it was not uncommon for them to separate enough to break the fuel lines. And when that fuel hose breaks, of course, oil's flying all over the place. It finally got so rough that Halsey ordered a cessation of the effort to fuel them and said, we'll do it tomorrow morning. Tomorrow morning never came as a calm sea. Halsey's weather officers were giving him incorrect input as to direction of the sea. They knew that they were near a typhoon. Halsey's effort to sail the fleet on a course away from the typhoon was incorrect based on the weather information being given him. So much so that he sailed the fleet into the typhoon. And the next day, instead of calm seas for refueling, we were in the middle of a typhoon with the seas were, the waves were someplace over 50 to 70 feet tall. The destroyers did not. It wasn't a case in which the destroyers ran out of fuel. That's incorrect. They all either had enough fuel, or if they didn't, they were smart enough to refill the tanks with seawater for ballast. What happened was that the ships were too small to accommodate those rough seas. They would try to climb up over the top and come down the other side, and the only way to take an incoming sea is on an angle, up and over and down. In coming up, the wind would catch them and broach them so that they would come down, and these big waves would come down on top and roll the ship. We lost three destroyers. The Spence, the Hull, and the Monahan all rolled and went down in our fleet. About 800 and some odd sailors were killed in the sinking of those 3 destroyers. After, toward the end of the second day, things began to calm down again, and Halsey was able to get the fleet out of the typhoon. Halsey was criticized all the way to Washington. They wanted to, Admiral King, I think it was in Washington, wanted to have him court-martialed. Admiral Nimitz in Pearl Harbor nixed the court-martial, but Halsey subsequently was transferred back to Pearl Harbor, and Admiral Spruance resumed command of the fleet, and it became the 5th Fleet instead of the 3rd Fleet. The odd thing is that 4 months later, in the spring of 1945, Halsey did the damn same thing and sailed into a 2nd typhoon. After which he was pulled back to Pearl Harbor and was sent to the Naval Hospital because of some condition, either genuine or whatever. Anyway, he wound up in the hospital, and he never again commanded a fleet. But that was Typhoon Cobra. One of my books has a picture of the. Do I have a picture?
Well, I got them right here. Unfortunately, because my camera might die. One of your personal photos?
Yeah, I had the Cobra picture down. A lot of my stuff is on is over on the Iowa because I'm there every Saturday.
Oh wow!
There's a couple of pictures.
Now, before we leave, I'm gonna take a photo with you holding one of these portraits of yourself.
That's one of me with my mother.
Aww. Wow.
That you'll see. Do you have that book, Bugle
Yes.
Boy, Bugle and Battleship Boy? Yeah. There's one in here that I have on display on the ship that draws a lot of comments. There I am at age 12.
Yep.
As a Boy Scout.
Boy Scouts. Ha! And now, which photo are you referring to that gets a lot of attention?
This one here.
That one right down there?
Yeah.
That's the one right behind me. Okay. That's the photo I want to take with you before I leave.
Oh, it's up there.
Yep.
Up there.
Yep.
Yeah.
Right there. So
Yeah.
then with that being said, and just in case this dies real quick, 2 more questions, and then I have 3
Sure.
Heroes Hall related questions. There was an incident that took place during the Battle of Okinawa that the North Carolina was attacked by 3 kamikazes, but also received a friendly 5-inch shell. And do you recall that? And
Oh, very well. Yeah.
what happened during
Well-
that, and what did you experience?
I'm not sure it was 3 kamikazes. I had never heard that there were 3 kamikazes, but the task unit that we were sailing with was under attack by a group of some kamikazes, and I'm not sure. My memory doesn't tell me specific names of ships, etc., except that we were basically under air attack by a group of kamikazes. One of the destroyers on our screen, circular screen, as I heard from the general consensus of what I was hearing at the time, was that the destroyer was tracking a kamikaze coming down, and in the course of doing so fired a 5-inch projectile which struck the port side of our ship on a director, a 5-inch director which was mounted on the top of a large tower, was struck, and we had some fatalities in the actual director, but a lot of shrapnel flew away from the point of impact, and some of the people up on the ENAV bridge and the signal bridge sustained injuries. So we had fatality and injuries. At the time of the hit, I did not. We were in general quarters, so I was below decks, and I was not aware that we'd been hit. There was no activity in the area where I was, which was in the chief's mess at that time. There was no activity like stretcher bearers or first aid parties or running, nothing. Except that the sound power telephone circuit told me that we'd been hit. And we kept right on sailing and fighting the air attack. But that's really all I can tell you about the hit. The ship went back to Pearl Harbor for repair, and we did not go back to the States. We went just back to Pearl Harbor.
So after going back to Pearl Harbor for repairs, did you return back to the South Pacific?
Yes. Well, it was at that time. It was the Central Pacific. Yeah, we were fighting. We were fighting up around the north of the Philippine Sea. I can't remember whether we were at the home islands of Japan or whether we were just out at sea, but it was up in that gentle northern Pacific area, Central Pacific.
And so you were off the coast of Japan when the atomic bombs were dropped.
Yes.
How did you hear about that?
We heard about it in increments. Of course, nobody knew anything about atomic bombs. The word atomic or atom had never been mentioned in anything that I knew anything about, because of the intense secrecy surrounding the preparation of the bomb. Obviously the troops and the personnel on Tinyan knew about it, but they knew it was a weapon, but they didn't know what it was. It was being loaded into the belly of a B-29. We in the fleet, the first we heard was an announcement that a new type weapon had been used in a major attack against the home islands. And a few days thereafter, there was a mess hall conversation. No official announcements, of course, but mess hall conversation that people were picking up off the radios, etc. That it was an atomic weapon, and that it had pretty well destroyed a Japanese city. And that's really all we heard until after the second bomb was dropped. Then the next we heard was an announcement that the Japanese had sued for surrender. And that boy.
Did you believe that announcement?
I didn't, yes, I believed that what they were telling us, although it was limited, because even the captain of the ship didn't have a lot of knowledge about it. He was only repeating what the press had put out over the air, and if there were official announcements from the Navy Department, etc., all of that would have been over my head. All I remember hearing was just scuttlebutt from radio, from enlisted people, radio men who stood watching over the radios. But I never heard an official announcement until it was announced by the captain, announcing that the hostilities had come to a close, but that we were to maintain our watchfulness because of the possibility of some either holdouts
Or rogue officers?
Rogue was never mentioned, but that the word may not have circulated completely through the enemy, and there could be additional, possibly, and particularly kamikaze attacks. And but nothing ever happened. And then the next was the Marine detachment on our ship. We had a company of I think 72 Marines on the ship, and they were preparing to form a force from all the other ships combined to prepare a landing force. But oh boy, it's hard now to look back because my memory is so weak in this area. But we had also received word from our bandmaster that our replacement band finally was coming from Washington to replace us. So I remember we were alongside a tanker. It was toward the very end of August. It was because our Marines were preparing for their landing. And we were refueling from this tanker, and we were advised by our bandmaster that our replacement band was on that tanker. So start packing your stuff. We're going to be leaving on that tanker. That was on the afternoon of either the 30th, 29th or 30th of August. While we were alongside the tanker, a large cargo net picked up, swung over and dropped down on our fantail. And we saw a whole bunch of musical instruments in this cargo net. So we knew the band was coming. And one by one, they swung the sailors over by bosun's chair between the ships, and they brought the new band aboard. A couple of hours later, the same cargo net, we threw all of our sea bags and instruments, everything, into this cargo net. A group of us jumped into the cargo net, and the whole works was picked up, swung over, dropped down on the tanker. And we stayed on the tanker for the balance of the afternoon, and eventually the tanker came alongside an aircraft carrier, and we transferred again. No. We stayed on the tanker until the ships in the fleet and the tanker all were back in Ulithi. And in Ulithi, we went from the tanker to an aircraft carrier, and on the aircraft carrier, we left to go back to Pearl Harbor. But either the day after we left or 2 days after we left, the surrender ceremony took place in Tokyo Bay. So we had mixed emotions because we were eager to get home. But by the same token, we'd been out there for a couple of years, and we felt kind of cheated, if you will, that we weren't allowed to be aboard for the surrender ceremony. I later learned, in actuality, that the North Carolina did not go into Tokyo Bay for the ceremony, because remember, the fleet in its entirety comprised over 150 ships. They're not so only the only the Missouri and the Iowa went into the harbor for the actual ceremony. The balance of the fleet was outside the harbor, sailing back and forth, as I understand it, because by then we were gone. But I know that only a limited number of ships actually went in to Tokyo Bay. But by that time, we were en route back to Pearl Harbor, and at Pearl Harbor, we were transferred from the aircraft carrier to a troop transport, a regular troop transport.
A Liberty ship?
AK, an AP, I mean, which is a personnel carrier. And we went from there to San Francisco. At San Francisco, we went to the receiving station on Treasure Island, and we were there for a couple of weeks until we could be arranged to go back to the School of Music.
Because you're on a 6-year contract.
Right, I'm on a 6-year enlistment. I've still got 2.5 years to go after, even though everybody else. They instituted a point system for discharge, and because these are mainly draftees and reserves, and they said if you got a point for every month that you were overseas, you got a point for your rating. So they had this point system, and if you had something like 15 points or so, you were eligible to go right away. And some ratings, like oddly enough, signalmen were being sent home immediately because they were doing away with the rating and taking it out of action. So there are no more signalmen in the Navy. They're all quartermasters. So at the time that these guys everybody was sitting around, I remember counting the number of points that they had on. Still, the point system was being devised even as we were still on the North Carolina. And I remember some of the guys on the ship were so happy because they had 14 points or 15 or something, and the band had, I think, something like 75 or 80 points, and we were the top of the list, obviously, because the band had been on the ship for over 2 years, and just on points per month alone, we were far up the ladder of points.
So, Lloyd, I have 3 final questions that I'd like to ask.
Sure.
One out-of-place question, though, that I forgot to ask that I just reminded myself is you mentioned that you grew up during the Depression and that your dad's wages increased primarily because of FDR coming into office. And the New Deal, not specifically, but you did mention FDR. Can you recall hearing about FDR's passing, and did that stir any emotion in you?
I learned about that when word of his death was passed among the fleet. There was an announcement by the ship's chaplain over the 1MC system. That's the public address system. Announcing the death of the president, and a moment of silence.
Was that something that you that impacted you, or not so much?
No, it didn't really, because it was not germane to anything having to do with me. It didn't have no effect on me. The war went on just as just another day.
So now to the final three questions. What does Heroes Hall mean to you?
What does that mean?
What does a place like Heroes Hall mean to you? Existing.
Heroes Hall, to me at this juncture, it's just a name because I don't know enough about it. I've never been there. I don't know anybody who's ever been there. And take that back. A neighbor across the street has been there, and that's his description of what he saw when he was there is the first knowledge I have of Heroes Hall.
Let me rephrase the question. Sorry. What I meant was, what does it mean, or how does it make you feel knowing that a place like Heroes Hall exists? Do you find it important, or do you find like those institutions to be important?
At this point in my life, it doesn't carry an impact. Put it that way. It's nice to know that they have it and that they're recognizing the people who fought the war. But it's so far back in my personal history that it's just not making an impression, to be honest with you. Any more than say the Battleship Alabama Memorial in Mobile, Alabama, or any of the other
Museums or memorials.
memorials. It's there. It happened. It's nice that there's recognition. I don't feel like a hero of any kind because I'm not one. But it is nice to know that you have it.
You actually just answered my second question, which was perfect. And then my final question. What does being an American mean to you?
Being an American? I never thought about it, to be honest. I've always been an American. It's just part of me. It's nice to know the security, both economically. It's nice to feel comfortable and safe, relatively safe, from political interference in my life, but I guess you'd have to compare it with what it feels like to be an American versus being a European or a farm laborer in South America, or God knows what. It's just a nice, comfortable feeling. Most days says a condition of being is what it is, and the security of being, absence of worry about significant things to others. But kids don't understand that, and I'm wondering what the average youngster visiting a place such as the memorial, or even visiting the Iowa or the North Carolina, what thoughts they have. I don't know if they can differentiate between the Iowa and Disneyland. Both are entertainment to them, but I don't know that any of the kids visiting the Iowa have ever asked me any questions that would indicate to me that they had an interest in World War II and things like that, any more than I would. I remember thinking, as I was just entering the Navy, or in my earliest years in the Navy, knowing that my father had been in the World War I in the Navy, to me, I thought he was irrelevant. Yeah, Dad, but back in your day, Dad, thing, etc. To me, he was way in the past, even though it was only something like 40 years at the most between World War I and II. These youngsters coming onto the Iowa, I don't think really have an interest in what the Iowa was doing in 1943, for instance.
Yeah.
To them, it's what is this thing and what does it do, and climbing up the ladders and things like that, going inside the turret. They don't ask questions that indicate to me that they have an interest in the ship and what it was doing in a war.
And what it represents,
Yeah.
so to speak, during the war. I got you.
They might be interested in how does this gun work, or etc. But when you get into the technicalities of for instance, ship operations, they don't seem to them it's irrelevant. So it's good that there are memorials that keep the World War II relevant to an adult as opposed to relevant to a kid. That's just my opinion.